All right, everybody. So today we have Eric Sparks, and I asked all of our presenters to send in just a short bio to me so you guys could know who they are, even though a lot of you met him at Career Day. So Eric grew up in the small town of Allgood, Alabama. He went on to receive a Bachelor's of Science in Marine Biology from Troy University and a PhD in Marine Sciences from the University of South Alabama and the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. Currently, he is the Director of Coastal and Marine Extension at Mississippi State University and serves dually as the Assistant Director for Outreach and Coastal Ecology Specialist for the Mississippi-Alabama Sea Grant Consortium. His research and extension efforts broadly focus on estuarine and marine ecology, coastal wetlands, coastal restoration, environmental stewardship, citizen science, and marine debris, all topics that we cover. And I asked him to send me just a fun fact about himself. So he put that he is terrified of glow sticks. So maybe somebody can ask him how that came about later on in the presentation. But I'll switch it over to you, Eric.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks for the invite, and I'm looking forward to chatting with y'all again. It was a nice meeting a lot of you at the career day. Shoot, that was a month ago or so now, wasn't it? Maybe a couple of weeks. Time's a blur at this point. But yeah, let me know if y'all can't hear anything or something's gone wrong with the technology, because I'm definitely not the most tech savvy person. But I'm going to talk to y'all today about living shorelines and some more stuff as well. First thing I'm going to do is give you a quick refresher on my background, and I do this to basically say that I came from a very small town with very limited resources, and got to where I'm at today. So y'all are way ahead at this point in your life, way ahead of where I was at about the same age as well. But as Carrie mentioned, I was born and raised in Allgood, Alabama. That's a little bitty town, 1 square mile, about 700 people live there. We've got 2 stop signs in the whole town, no lights, just stop signs. So it's a fun place to grow up. Then I went to Troy University. I went there to play football pretty much. But while I was there, they're like, you have to major in something. So I was like, oh, marine biology sounds cool. So I picked that, but then fell in love with it. Did some undergrad classes or summer classes at Dauphin Island Sea Lab, and that's kind of where I got my networking and foothold in to do grad school down there. And so graduated there, did a short postdoc / project manager job with the Weeks Bay Foundation, which I know a lot of y'all are familiar with. And then from there, transitioned into like my actual career, I would say, at that point. So my first like real job after college was with the Southwest Florida Water Management District, and I worked on their springs and flows department. So did some spring restoration work, did a lot of like calculating the amount of water withdrawals you can have out of a river before it causes an environmental help, and then or it causes environmental harm. And then after that, I got a call from Mississippi State and Sea Grant about this position, and haven't left yet. So I've been here for about 5 years, or a little over 5 years now. So yeah. So the job I currently have is extension based. So everything in extension is kind of based on programs. So the overall program that I run is the Coastal Conservation and Restoration Program. And then there's the website and then my email address there, but I'll show you that again later on. And you also have a copy of this PowerPoint I sent Carrie as well. But I definitely don't want to overstate my involvement in this, because it's definitely a team effort. This is a subset of the team. This is actually an old slide. We've added some folks, and some folks have moved on to bigger and better things that are on this slide since then. But in general, we normally have anywhere between 15 to 20 folks in the group, and they're the real reasons why we've been able to accomplish what we have so far. So keep that in mind. Being an extension-based program, our primary goal is to produce information, whether that's us conducting the research ourselves or just finding it and packaging it up and getting it to people in a way that they can use it. And that information needs to be based on documented needs. For our group, the people that we ask the majority of the time, like, what do you need to make your job easier, more effective, better, whatever, are natural resource managers. So a lot of the folks that y'all in Gulf Corps are working with a good bit. So people that work at the National Estuary Research Reserves, Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA, those kind of folks there. So that's basically, I show you this figure to show that everything starts with a needs assessment with us and then ends in a needs assessment, because it's a cyclical pattern there. Carrie mentioned that we do some marine debris work, so I want to briefly mention that before we get into the living shoreline topic. So we run the Mississippi Coastal Cleanup Program. We turn that into a more broader extension program with the same name, so we do a lot of education with that. We do research from microplastics to underwater mapping with a little ROV of marine debris, to working with commercial shrimpers to help incentivize them to properly dispose of marine debris and just clean up the sound so it doesn't impact their bottom line as much, as well as some barrier island monitoring. That's the photo there on the far left for marine debris accumulation rates. We also do a lot of environmental education work. One program that y'all might be interested in is the Mississippi Master Naturalist Program. Your fearless leader, Miss Graham, went through that years ago. It was before I was in this position, but she went through that and seemed to enjoy it. Definitely ask her about it at some point, but especially an environmental stewardship training program. A lot of the lessons and knowledge and experience that you're gaining right now is in line with the Master Naturalist Program. So a lot of it would be kind of repetitive for y'all, but still it's a good network to be in there. We also do some work with, we have a under 18 version of that program called the Student Naturalist Program, and then we're working with a couple high schools to grow wetland plants, salt marsh plants that we then use for restoration projects, and that's called the Planet Marsh project there. And then last but not least, we also work on living shoreline work, and pretty much any component you can think of for living shorelines, we work on it, whether it's from the research needed to design these things better, to monitoring them to see how successful they are down the road, to outreach, to working with contractors, that kind of stuff. Like basically anything involving living shorelines, we're working on it at least tangentially there. So now the rest of the talk, well, not necessarily all the rest of the talk, but a good bit of it is focused on living shorelines. And so to understand living shorelines, you really need to understand like what a basic wetland definition is, because the primary type of habitat that's tried to be protected or restored with living shoreline projects is coastal wetlands, and around here predominantly salt marshes. So a wetland is just basically an area that's saturated enough with water that it influences its characteristics. And those characteristics are it grows unique vegetation there, and it has hydric soils. Hydric soils basically just means that it's got low oxygen in it. So the little photo there, the two soil clumps, you can see the reddish one has oxygen all the way down through it, whereas the dark one does not. Really dark soils are indicative of low oxygen, which is also an indicator for wetland. The type of wetland or coastal wetland that we have, like on our fringes around here, are salt marshes. And so, yeah, I know that y'all are very familiar with salt marshes, but in generally they're found in mid to high latitudes. So that's why there's a photo of the globe down there. So if you drop down into the lower latitudes, salt marshes are replaced with mangroves. So if you've heard of mangroves or seen those, before. They're basically occupy the same space that salt marshes do. It's just when it gets warmer, they outcompete salt marshes for that area. Um, so, and you can see that in that little map there too. The real transition point is basically like once you turn south and go down the panhandle of Florida, like you start to see a mix of mangroves and marshes. Then likewise over in Texas, kind of where you get to that same latitude, you get start getting a mix of mangroves and marshes. But as the farther south you go, the higher the ratio of mangroves to marshes there. And so when I do a living shoreline talk, I typically show this slide at each one, regardless of the audience, whether it's kids, contractors, natural resource managers, whoever, politicians. But I always ask, like, okay, if you see these two things here, if you're going to guess which one has the most fish at it, like where would you prefer to go fishing at if you're wanting to catch something, which area would it be? Most people, I would say 95% plus, always say the marsh. I ask them, where do you think the water quality is better? They normally say the marsh side. And then I can go on and on, but basically those are natural benefits that are provided by nature that people recognize for salt marshes, and they kind of disassociate those with hardened shorelines like bulkhead there on the left side of the screen. And so once I get them on that train of thought, they typically hooked at that point, because if they start saying they prefer bulkheads to living shorelines, then I can be like, well, what did you say earlier? Kind of thing. So that's one slide that I typically show. And some of the reasons, as I mentioned before, that we need to protect, conserve, restore, whatever term you want to call it, our shorelines, is because they do provide a bunch of coastal protection. They protect a bunch of upland properties, which are really valuable to us, as well as provide habitat for the majority of the seafood species that we consume for at least some point in their life cycle. I believe there's estimates out there that show that about 90% of the seafood that we eat relies on estuary habitats for at least some point in their life cycle, with coastal wetlands being one of those major habitats. Because they're such a good habitat, and these are also hot spots for things like recreational fishing, like that person there holding the big redfish. People pay a lot of money to come down and do these inshore charters, stay in a hotel and all that. So it's a big economic driver that we have. The nursery role that these habitats provide can't be understated, because it allows a lot of little critters to be able to grow up to big things that we care about, or that feed the food web later on down the road. And they're good at filtering pollution as well. And it works primarily because of the area that they occupy. So they're in what's called the intertidal habitat, or intertidal area, which is the area between the low tide and the high tide. So when the tide comes up, it allows these little critters to be able to access the marsh to get a bunch of nutrition that's up there, while also hiding from predators. But then when the tide goes out, that also takes a lot of that nutrition out to the tidal creek and fuels bigger things or more organisms too. And then also this pushing and pulling the water through the marsh helps to filter it and clean it. It's basically like a big sponge that goes through, and it's very effective at doing that. My grad school research was focused on how effective marshes are at being basically at removing nutrient pollution. But if you put a net out at high tide facing the marsh, and then left it out there until low tide, this is the type of things you would catch in it. So it's kind of hammering home the point of the nursery habitat. You'll catch some medium to small shrimp, little crabs, a bunch of little killifish, and just other smaller fish. So this really emphasizes that these areas are important nursery grounds, and it fuels the food web farther up, or the food chain farther up the trophy level. So now that we know how much, or all these things that marshes do, I'm typically asked this question. So I don't know how interactive we can be, like if people can guess on these things or not, but I always ask folks, how much is a marsh worth? So if you could add those things up, Was that somebody trying to chime in and guess? No? Okay. How much is a marsh worth? And then ask them.
I think Braylon wanted to answer.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I want to guess. I would say probably $5,000, maybe.
So $5,000 per acre.
Yeah, give or take.
Okay. And that's how much you think it's worth, or how much you would pay for it?
That's how much I think it's worth.
Okay.
I don't have money to pay for
Okay.
marsh at all.
Gotcha.
I think it's probably worth millions because that habitat is a nursery, and I don't think that that's really replaceable, and I think that that makes it very expensive just in itself.
Gotcha. Anybody else want to guess?
I think it's worth millions as well when you consider like the ecosystem services it provides, like providing buffers during hurricanes and filtering water and all that stuff. Wasn't this a question in one of the EPA things? Like I saw this question very recently. I don't remember where.
It was. Look
Yeah.
at that, Creighton, tying everything together.
It was.
Awesome. Well, I hope that my estimate is not that far off from the EPA one if y'all got one. But based on a publication from 2014, if you add up those ecosystem services that were captured, it's about $79,000 per acre per year. So it's important to remember that these things provide benefits all the time. It's not a one-shot thing. So those that answered millions, yeah, you're definitely right there, because most of these marshes have been around for way more than 10, 15, 20 years. They've been around for a lot longer than that. So the amount of ecosystem services they provided is well into the millions there. So I always like to think of marshes as that old car that you or your parents may have in the yard that does everything that you need it to do, but nobody really appreciates it like they should. So I've got one of these in my yard now. I used to have two of them, so I can relate to this. But people in general, like developers, you can't build on these marshes, and so that's, to them, that's relatively useless property. So like if someone's trying to sell a bunch of marsh, it normally goes for very cheap, relatively speaking, maybe a couple $1,000s per acre there. So it's not in the like the real estate general mindset that folks think of. It's not really worth that much, but when it comes to the value it provides, it's worth a lot. All right, so now we're going to go talk about the opposite of conserved and restored shorelines for a little bit, and those are hardened shorelines. And so those, I put that enter the dark side thing up there, but there's definitely a time and place for these hardened shorelines, such as bulkheads, seawalls, and even like a little bit softer but still hardened shoreline, like a riprap barrier there, like you see on the bottom right of the screen. But these are way more common than they should, and it's really caused some big time impacts on our ecosystem. Some of those include the general loss of intertidal area. So if you've seen a bulkhead before, more than likely there was not any marsh vegetation out in front of it, but also more than likely when that bulkhead was installed, there was marsh vegetation in front of it. And so I've circled kind of those areas here in yellow. And so what happens is when a wave comes in and crashes into the bulkhead, part of the wave energy goes up, and that's the splash that you see. Part of the wave energy goes down, and that just basically scours out the foot of the, or toe of the bulkhead, and leads to the loss of anything that was in front of it. And so that is functionally the loss of the intertidal habitat, which we've just talked about how important that is. So if you imagine the tide coming in and going out, it only goes vertical on a bulkhead, whereas in a natural shoreline, it goes horizontal as well. It runs up the shore and then off the shore. And that, even though that seems like a little trivial difference, that is huge when it comes to maintaining healthy coastlines like that. I put the bathtub thing on there because if you're sitting in a bathtub, you can kind of look at some of the potential impacts of bulkheads. Because if you push a wave up, make a little splash in the bathtub, it bounces around the walls in there. So it'll hit one wall, bounce to the other, and then eventually it'll dissipate. But if you push hard enough that it goes up on the lip or on the floor, it ain't coming back in. It's fully dissipating. The marshes or natural shorelines are definitely more like the flat surfaces, whereas the bulkheads more like the walls of the bathtub. And so these waves bouncing around definitely cause some issues. Some of these issues you can see. This is an extreme example, but this is the west end of Dolphin Island. You'll see each one of those panes are a different year, 2011, 2015, 2017. And you can see a bulkhead that was put in around this one house on the west end of Dolphin Island, and see how that's led to scouring of the shore west of that over just a relatively few years. So just for reference, when I was in grad school, just west of that house, we used to have like competitive volleyball tournaments out there. Now that same area where we used to play volleyball is about six feet deep water. So that's a huge difference over a relatively short period of time. Again, this is an extreme example, but it's still an example. And this is caused from that wave scouring and general disruption of flow and sediment transport provided by this bulkhead. All right. And then also these hardened shorelines are inevitably going to fail, like nothing lasts forever, you know. And this causes it's a huge cost to shoreline property owners. And this particular bulkhead was in Goshen, Mississippi. And this is what it looked like after one Category 1 storm. The property owner put this in the year before, paid $75,000 to have it installed, and this is what it looked like after about a year there. So he's got to spend another $75K, if not more, getting this fixed. And his neighbor, which you can't really see from this, you can kind of see it in this photo if you know what you're looking for, but his neighbor hasn't done anything with his shoreline, and it's looked after the storm, didn't even look like anything had happened there. So that begs the question why people do these kind of projects. And a lot of it comes down to just familiarity. Contractors are most familiar with hardened shorelines. They've been putting them in for a long time. And then property owners by default are also more familiar with that. One of the first questions a private or a waterfront property owner asks a realtor is, or someone that's looking for waterfront property, is, does it have a good bulkhead in it? Is it a new bulkhead? It's like roofs for most houses. Like, oh, is the roof good? It's like, is the bulkhead good? But I like to show this one figure here that Noah put together that shows a hardened shoreline on one side and a living shoreline on the other. It talks about a lot of the things that we've already talked about as far as ecosystem services, but it does a good conceptual diagram about what a living shoreline project looks like, where it's trying to restore, conserve shoreline vegetation. Some of them have an oyster reef component to them, where they're trying to enhance secondary productivity or oysters. Those are a little less common around here, but they still do exist. And this is a photo of like a real life living shoreline project, a small scale one that was done just last year. So this project was only 3 or 4 months old when this photo was taken. You can see what it looked like before. It was basically a straight drop off with someone had put riprap in front of because they were afraid they were going to lose their shoreline. And we helped this is a camp over in Biloxi. We helped them put in a couple breakwaters and then regraded their shoreline and planted behind it in the different zones that you see here. And so that's really it's really taken off. It's filled in way more than it was even in this photo and done well. So they should not have to worry about their shoreline basically forever now. And their total project there cost about $10,000, and they got a quote for a bulkhead that was $50,000 for the same area. So that leads into this one. In general, these living shoreline projects are cheaper, particularly in lower wave energy environments. Than bulkheaded areas. Bulkheads cost basically the same wherever you put them, whereas living shorelines vary depending on the type of wave protection you need. But in general, they're cheaper. And so what I like to do is have folks think about these two things, bulkheads and living shorelines, like bank accounts. And so a bulkhead is inherently going to be the strongest it's going to be the day that it's built, because there isn't a whole lot of living components to it. Like, it's an engineered, pretty much just an engineered structure that's made out of dead things or non-living things. So when you put it in, it's as strong as it's going to be, and it's just going to gradually get weaker over time until it fails. Whereas a living shoreline is the weakest is probably going to be the day that it's built, and then as those plants grow in and those living components take hold and grow, it gets stronger over time. So if you were going to invest some of your money, would you want to put it in something that you know is going to depreciate over time, or something that you're pretty certain is going to improve over time? And so if we fast forward here to that kind of failure point with a bulkhead versus like a grown-in living shoreline project, that's what you see here. So that's some of the things that we tell contractors whenever we're trying to get them to sell these type of projects. And so a lot of our work is based on working with contractors and property owners to just give them all of the science-based information they need to make the right decisions for their property. And then we also do a lot of the research and put together materials based on that research to help with design of these projects. And this next section of the talk, which will be pretty short, I think it'll be pretty short here, goes over some of the things that you need to think about if you're designing a living shoreline project. First and foremost, if you're interacting with a private property owner and not one of these big projects, so y'all are probably familiar with these large-scale living shoreline projects that are NOAA Restore funded and things like that. We predominantly work with private property owners, so the smaller scale projects. And the reason we hone in on that particular subset is because well over 90%, probably over 95% of coastal property is privately owned. So to have a real big impact, you need to convince private property owners that this is something to do, because you could do living shoreline projects on all of the publicly, federally, state, whatever owned property, and you still wouldn't get, 5-10% of the total waterfront property covered. So first and foremost, you need to figure out what the private property owner wants. And I'm not going to go through all these individual questions, but in a nutshell, if you're trying to pitch them something that is inherently opposite to what they need or want out of their shoreline, they're not going to go for it. But we typically can find like a middle ground where their private property owners say, like, yeah, I would like to have boat access. And then we're like, well, you can build a boathouse and boat slip. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to bulkhead your whole property for that. So you can do hardened on the small portion and soft on the other portions there. And as I mentioned, that you can definitely still have structures like docks, piers. A lot of people assume that because you're doing one of these natural shoreline projects, that means you can't access your shoreline, you can't have a pier, any of that stuff, and that's just not true. This is an overhead photo from a project in Perdido Beach, Alabama, and that's the green areas where we did the project. It was mostly just resloping and planting, and you can see what it looked like before and after there. And they still have all the water access that they want, and I think they only spent, we just did the design stuff for here, but they only spent, I want to say $5,000 on their whole shoreline, and the the bulkhead quote was like $30,000 here, and they shouldn't have to worry about their shore for a long time, if ever, now. And then another thing, if you're trying to figure out like what salinity regime you're in, and a bunch of other characteristics that you need to do a design, you need to go out and do a survey. That includes plant, sediment, shoreline slope, wave energy, and then the neighboring shoreline. So for plants, you really want to figure out what plants are to your left and right or in the same general area. It's not rocket science. A lot of times you're basically just trying to mimic what's natural around you there. So figure out what type of plants are there. That can give you an indication of the type of species that you should purchase or design for in this project, and then also zonation. So how many different types of plants and where are they located? I got a figure for that later on. And we've typically had more success with larger pots of plants. And so like 1 gallon pots seem to be better than the smaller pots, but particularly in higher wave energy areas. And then if you're planting, always plant deeper than what you think you need to. Most of these plants can adjust if they're a little bit deeper, but having them about an inch or so, the top of the sod about an inch or so below the sediment surface, and then you fill the hole back in with sediment, really helps hold that sod in place and doesn't let it float back up and out on the next high tide. That the suction that's there that really helps. And also definitely don't skimp. We tell contractors this, like plants are relatively cheap, but they're the most important thing for when it comes to property owners being satisfied. So definitely don't skimp on those. And we have little worksheets or fact sheets too that are available on a website that I'll give you a link to later on that has a lot of this info in it if you're ever interested in doing these type of shoreline restoration projects. I mentioned zonation. Different plants can handle different levels of salt, and they can handle different levels of being wet, basically. So the two major plants that we plan for are Spartina alterniflora, which is smooth cordgrass, and black needle rush, which is the scientific name is Juncus romerianus. There, that's the only two plants that are in this particular project. The bright green stuff on the leading edge is the Spartina. It can handle being wet longer, so it can live at a lower elevation, whereas the Juncus can't handle being flooded quite as much, so it's a little bit higher elevation. And those differences are very small, like a couple inches max of difference can turn a Spartina marsh into a Juncus marsh or vice versa there. But having this zonation is important. And this figure here shows like a typical zonation for the northern Gulf of Mexico marshes, where you have like your smooth cordgrass on the leading edge, then you get into your Juncus romerianus or black needle rush farther on, and then there's other things like bushes and trees and some saltier plants kind of in the middle there that are typical of a wide natural marsh. We don't normally get beyond the Juncus for these private property owners because they've got a lawn that comes up to about that point there. Waves are another big consideration. If you live somewhere where there's a whole lot of boats running back and forth, there it could be naturally a calm area, but those boats provide a lot of wave energy, which provides a lot of erosion. So you may need to build some breakwater or wave protection there, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But and then there's also a thing called fetch, which is basically the amount of the length of water that wind can like blow up waves and build them up before it impacts the shoreline. So this particular diagram you see here with the yellow lines, where they all converge is that Camp Wilkes shoreline, but you can see based on the wind direction, there's longer fetch. So if the wind's coming out of the east, it could blow up waves that are a lot bigger than if winds were coming directly from the south there, because there's a highland protecting that area. So that's just something to consider. There's tools that you can do to estimate this based on the winds in the area, but it's not overly complicated, but there's a lot of terminology here. Slope is another consideration. If it's a bluff, it's going to be hard to do anything there, but if it's something that can be smoothed out, or you could add sediment and then regrade it, then that's great. You want the slope to be as low as possible. You want it to be as gradual as possible, because then you can get all of that zonation that I talked about earlier in there. Sediment, not going to dive into this, but basically we operate with extremes when it comes to these living shoreline projects, with either sand or clay. And the clay silt type sediment is typically thought of as more functional, helps provide a lot more of those services that we talked about earlier, like nutrient removal. It's generally the plants do a little bit better in it, but sand is heavier, so it stays in place a little bit better. So when you're doing a restoration project in an area that is a little bit higher energy, definitely try to err towards more sandier sediment, because it's heavier, stays in place better. And then I think that's the last, yeah. Whoop, let me go back. The last thing to consider is, if you're in an area with higher wave energy, then what plants can typically handle, you may have to put in a seal, which is basically like a little rock toe almost that you backfill behind it, that's completely under the low tide mark most of the time. Or you need to put in a breakwater, which that very center picture there is a good photo of breakwater, where you can see it's a big rock wall that breaks the waves before it impacts the marsh there. There are tons of different materials you can use for this kind of stuff, from cast concrete to these reef balls, which are there at the bottom center of the screen, which were designed for like artificial reefs for offshore fish, but they've been used for living shoreline projects as breakwaters, coral logs, oyster castles, even the fireplace stones, pavers that you get from Home Depot or Lowe's. Those can be used as a breakwater, and we've seen some people that use just basically bags of concrete to put out. And so when you put all this stuff together, you basically get this conglomeration of a bunch of different designs, techniques that are used to get to the same common goal, and that's to provide habitat provide nutrient removal, and generally just conserve and restore shoreline vegetation. So you can see these 4 different living shoreline projects. They all look very different, but they all have the same goal in mind. If you want to learn more about these, there's a lot of resources, and we continually add to it at this website. There's a link below. Basically, if you Google Sea Grant Living Shorelines, this will come up. But the contractor resources tab is probably the most helpful, and there's a bunch of guidebooks on there as well, for Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida, that are good resources. And there's also like some web tutorial stuff. And so, since I know a lot of y'all are kind of transitioning into your careers, your early career, or students, or those type, in that kind of category, I want to throw a slide in here about job hunting as well. So what I did, I went through a bunch of these, and I learned a bunch of lessons when I was like finishing up my degrees and applying for jobs. I didn't know what an extension job was until I actually saw this ad for this job that I'm actually in, but I did know in general what I wanted to do. I wanted to do applied research, so stuff that's needed right now, and then kind of demystify science. So work to transition science from very complicated language that you see in peer-reviewed journals to folks that can use it, like contractors with a backhoe putting in living shoreline projects. I knew I wanted to do that, but I didn't know what the job was called. So I think the first thing you need to do is figure out what you want to do with your job, So your long-term goal, your dream job, and then figure out if that's realistic. You know, people need to make different amounts of money. So I would definitely consider looking at salaries for those typical jobs, if they even exist, and then work towards filling in specific gaps in your resume that you need to get to that dream job. Just pull the ad for your dream job, look at the minimum qualifications for it, and try. It may take you 10 years to get there, but try to check off everything that you need from that ad like you were applying for it then. And then plan ahead. Again, it's a very slow process. If I was looking for jobs, I would start applying 4 to 6 months before you actually need a job, and then try to be not geographically limited. It's a relatively small world we live in here, and there's only so many jobs to go around. So if you say I'm only going to work in Alabama, that's going to significantly limit you. And then apply for a bunch of jobs. I probably applied for, I'm guessing, 100 jobs when I was finishing up my grad school. And I think I got interviewed for about 7 of them. Fortunately, I got interviews for the 3 of the top 4 jobs that I wanted, and really lucked out in that situation. But again, those are just some tips there. And we're always open to collaborations, and we routinely have internships and job openings. So shoot us an email. I know some of y'all have sent me a resume already, and I've got it saved. This summer is a little weird with all this Corona stuff going on, but I do have but feel free to shoot me a resume, any questions you may have. And if you want to work together on some projects, let me know. That's my contact info. But now I'll take whatever questions y'all had. I saw a bunch of them popping up when I was
Yeah. Yeah, we got quite a few good ones, and you actually answered a lot of them as well. But
Okay.
one I wanted to have Boris ask his, because I thought it was pretty cool. So if you can, you can put in yours.
Hey, mine was that I asked, when you guys do the reestablishing the shorelines, do you guys ever have issues with invasive species coming in because you're like disturbing the already like established area there?
Fortunately, the areas where we focus most on these living shoreline projects is in the Inner Palace, which is inherently a stressful area that's pretty salty. So it kind of excludes a lot of the invasive species. We do have to deal with Phragmites sometimes, torpedo grass, Kogan grass on the upland edges of it, but in general, we don't really have to worry about invasives too much from the plant side of things there. So if we get in fresher areas, we'll get into a little bit more invasives, but the saltier the areas, the less you got to worry about that.
Right, I figured, but I might as well just ask because in every like ecosystem we worked in, whenever anyone disturbs anything, something pops up.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and that is a good thing about working in these salt marshes is the salt and the flooding. There's only a certain amount of plants that's adapted to be able to handle that. So that's a good benefit there.
All right, and we have another question, kind of project-based, from Haley about agencies and working with others.
Okay.
Hi, I was just wondering, like you said a lot, you work with private like people or companies a lot. Do you ever work with the state or federal agencies? And if you do, like what do y'all work on? What projects do you collaborate on?
Yeah, so a lot of those big living shoreline projects that y'all are probably familiar with, that's restore funded. We do a lot of work on like monitoring those. For instance, the Swift Track one over in Alabama. We did 4 years of monitoring on that one just to figure out like how successful that particular design is. We do a lot of trainings for federal folks and state folks as well. So that ADCNR, which I think Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, and NOAA, EPA, trying to think if there's any other ones that are kind of in that living shoreline world. And the reserves, the natural estuary research reserves. So a lot of those folks will be like, hey, we need to know the wave energy to design this project, and then we'll kind of step in and be like, okay, we've got the technology to do that, the know-how, and so we'll go in and help with components for designing the project, but also just doing a bunch of training for them, trying to figure out what they need to make their job easier. So we definitely work a lot with non-private folks. We just focus a lot of our extension work on private property. And you're the Troy alum, right?
That's me. Go Trojans.
Go Trojans.
All right, Eric had a question about if you have a success story. If I don't know, he's not on the screen, I don't think, but he should be on chat or on call.
Yeah.
Yeah. You want to ask your question?
Yes. What is? Hold on. Let me scroll up. Do you have a Pacific shoreline that you are most proud of, and where is it?
Probably that one I showed y'all a couple pictures of, that Camp Wilkes one. That one is by far the quickest success we've had out of the Living Shoreline project. Most of the time when we do these, it stresses out. The plants get stressed out, so it actually looks like garbage for about until the next growing season. And then at that point, it kind of takes off. But this Camp Wilkes one, I think it's because of when we planted it, like late winter. It basically jumped straight into its growing season, and it took off immediately. I mean, it looks like if you took someone out there and was like, how long has this marsh been here? It's only been there for a year, but most people would probably say like 20 years. Like it's settled in nice. Another thing about Camp Wilkes, which is particularly fulfilling, is they actually had a grant to put in a bulkhead there, and we were looking for intern housing options and visited with them, and they told us about that grant to put in a bulkhead. They already had the money and everything, and the contractor was supposed to start like within 2 weeks of that point of putting it in. And we were like, wait, like hear us out for a little bit. And we went and came and did a presentation at the board meeting, which was like 2 days after I met with them there. And they decided to ask the funding agency if they can swap that grant, that bulkhead grant, to the Living Shoreline grant, and that's that project there. So that was a kind of icing on the cake for that one.
That's pretty cool. We have a couple environmental education questions as well, but I'm going to let Ashley ask hers because she has some experience in this, and so I'll pass it to you, which I think she's on the phone as well.
Hey, Britt. Yes, I'm on the phone. Sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties with my webcam. I saw where you talked about your environmental education and outreach. I've worked as an environmental education intern in the past and enjoyed it greatly. And I educated both the younger and older generations, and I feel that's very crucial for protecting the environment, is to educate everyone from little bitty to very old. But my question is, when you're doing this outreach, what are some of the topics you mainly discuss, and does it pertain to the range of the age in your audience? Doing outreach myself, I know it can be hard at times if you have a mix of children and grandparents and try to make it entertainable and educational for both at the same time.
Yeah. What I tell folks in our group is, for the most part, you can do the same PowerPoint for kindergartners as you can for natural resource managers. It's just a picture show, and you just tailor your words to fit the audience at that point. That one I just showed y'all would definitely not be suitable for kindergartners, but for the most part, yeah. But I agree, it's extremely important, and navigating the difference in education level is something that is very, very difficult when you're limited in the amount of time you have, and you only got so many different ways you can explain something. I don't know if there's a magic bullet for overcoming that other than trying to really focus on the key concepts and relate it to examples. For instance, when I showed y'all the graph with the bulkhead and living shoreline strength over time, like talking about that when it comes to bank accounts makes it sink in for a wide range of folks there. So relatable examples are crucial, and also trying to set up the conversation to where you get folks to agree with you at the beginning too. So another thing, like from this talk, that one of the opening slides when I was like, which one of these do you prefer? The bulkhead or living shoreline for fishing, water quality, all that kind of stuff. You already get folks in the mindset to be open to kind of listening to what you're saying at that point, and also like they'll have a tendency to almost want to contradict themselves at the end, but then they won't, because they know that it will contradict themselves if they say something counter to what they've already agreed with. Not saying you should be like a slimy used car salesman, but it's important to kind of design your presentations in a way that kind of leads people, kind of takes their hand and walks them through it, if that makes sense there. But we do a lot of different activities too. We've got another grant now that's living shoreline focused, but I know that's a topic that's hard for younger folks to grasp. So we're building wave tanks for kids that can make waves and see the differences in the different shoreline types and that kind of stuff. Now that's one of the grants from EPA that we have going now.
That's pretty cool. I have
Yeah,
one
that
more
was
question.
awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. I have one more question from Amber, and it's kind of relating to bulkheads as well. And it's about like working with residents. Do you want to ask that, Amber?
Sure. No, like some of like the research that I did last summer, working with the city of Gulf Shores. I don't know. It's hard for me to like figure out like how would you do like that when like in a neighborhood, like in a residential area, like along like in a little lagoon, like in the channel systems, where a lot of those places they have like the bulkhead set up. Like if you were to be in an area like that and you had like one of the people that wanted to integrate one of the living shorelines, but say like the neighbors around them didn't, would you end up with a situation where like their area, like their yard was eroding because of like the neighbors around them?
Yeah, for sure. And that's when our site assessment, one of the first things we do is try to figure out what's around that particular property, because in the northern Gulf of Mexico, this doesn't apply to those little lagoon canals you're talking about, but in the more openly flowing areas in the northern Gulf of Mexico, if you have a bulkhead to the east of you, then you're going to be impacted pretty severely by that bulkhead. That's just because the water and sediment typically flows from east to west. So if the bulkhead's there, it's going to impede that, which may cause erosion on your property. Whereas if there's a bulkhead to the west of you, it actually might help accrete some sediment to a point there. So position of bulkheads is important, but those canals you're talking about, they are, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they're the ones that are very narrow, relatively narrow, and they've got bulkheads on both sides of them. And those areas, the houses seem to be built pretty close to the bulkhead. There really isn't much you can do there, except for there's other technologies. The Nature Conservancy's done this in Foul River, I believe. They put in what's called pesco cages, which are basically like these cages that are bolted to the front of a bulkhead, filled up with sediment and marshes planted in them. It reminds me of like those window boxes you have for plants, if you want to grow plants right outside your window, but it's just on the front of a bulkhead and bigger. It provides some habitat benefits. Some of the other benefits, definitely not the magnitude of a more natural shoreline there. So that is an option for folks that really can't do anything except have a bulkhead. But yeah, good question, good considerations
Yeah.
that we have to take into account there.
All right, well, that's all of the ones I had collected from the chat, but if anyone has a burning question that didn't get answered that wants to ask it now, they can.
Oh yeah, I had a question actually. Earlier when you said how marshes usually aren't, they aren't really bought or sold when it comes down to actual acreage and stuff like that. But if someone were to buy acreage of just marsh and just build on top of it, wouldn't they be responsible for replacing that marsh somewhere else, since it is a very delicate ecosystem?
Yeah, so you can't, most scenarios, you can't build on top of, you can't fill a wetland. So you couldn't bring in sediment and fill it up to where it essentially dries up. They don't really, it's tough. It really depends on how much, it depends on a lot of things. But if you are in a situation where you build on top of a wetland, there are things called mitigation strategies and mitigation banks that are available, where if you build on that, you may have to restore, if you build on 1 acre, you may have to restore 2 acres of marsh somewhere else, or maybe 5 or 7. It varies depending on location and habitat. But yeah, if you do build on a wetland, you do have to mitigate somehow. What that looks like varies a lot, but you have to mitigate somehow. There's actually a lot of places that own what are called mitigation banks, which are basically just like really big areas of wetland that they'll sell places. Say a casino say they build a casino on some wetlands here in Mississippi. To offset that casino, they need to mitigate 20 acres of wetland. They basically go to that mitigation bank and buy 20 acres of wetland and basically say this will never be developed ever. It's not actually adding wetlands, but it's conserving wetlands into the future. So there's activities like that that can occur there. But I know that was a long answer to your question, but hopefully I answered it.
Yeah.
All right, any others?
I have one just to finish us out. Nobody asked it, but Erik, I gotta ask, what's up with the glow sticks? Why are you terrified of them?
Yeah, when I was, I don't know, 4 or 5 years old, we were driving to Six Flags, and my mom, just to like make me behave, I guess, threw me a glow stick just to play with, like break it, or to just play with in the back seat of the car. Six Flags was like a 3-hour drive from where I grew up, and I was playing with it too much, and I broke it, and it went in my eyes. And if you ever got glow stick in your eyes, like you literally can't see for like 30 or 40 minutes. It burns really bad. I just remember we were in the middle of nowhere, like right on the Alabama-Georgia line, and had to pull over at somebody's house off of the road, and they didn't even have running water in their house. We had to do like a pump, like a well pump, and get water to get my eyes and rinse it out. So that's why I don't like glow sticks. That's story there.
I apologize if I brought back some bad memories. Yeah. And I'm sorry for laughing, but
no, it's
put
funny.
it out there, so I had to ask it.
Yeah.
But awesome. Well, thanks, Erik. I think that wraps us up, and we really appreciate you taking the time for this. It was super informative, and I think we have some other topics that kind of like sprung up from this. So
awesome.
Again, and I recorded the meeting, so I'll send that out to you so you can pass it along to your folks too.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Appreciate it. And y'all